In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. I was so shocked when one of my university professors began his very first class with this Bible verse. Being a Christian believer, I was thrilled. I was like, okay, this is going to be a fun ride. Until the next moment when the professor said, and the Bible begins from here. So I raised my hand and I said, sir, the Bible technically does not begin from here actually. It begins from the book of Genesis and it says, in the beginning God created the earth and the heavens. And while it's true that indeed in the beginning was the Word, this statement comes much later in the Bible. In the next few weeks, it became pretty clear to me that the professor did not appreciate my fact checking. And that was ironic because he was teaching us news reporting. The rivalry became so prominent that on one occasion, he straight up asked me, Miss Masih, what do you want to do with your life? So I said, sir, maybe I'll become a features writer with some English daily. I wasn't sure at the time. So he said, Miss Masih, if you made it to the Times of India, I'm going to change my name. Yeah, that's what he said. I was angry, of course. Cut to 2 years later. I was sitting with an offer letter from the Times of India as a features writer. I was excited. I was like, okay, I should call my friends from mass communication course. I should tell them this. Each one of those people told me the same thing. Get a copy of that offer letter, send it to Mr. Singh with the message, sir, it's time to change your name. Let's park this story right here and remember where I left it and allow me to introduce today's agenda for the day. So I chose 3 principles today. Of all the writing principles I could have chosen, I chose these 3 principles. And why is that? Not because they were the most profound principles, but for one single reason that these are the only 3 ones I have managed to follow over a course of 16 years career. And this is what I want to share today. For the first principle, allow me to tell you another story. So after I did my mass communication course, I interned with the Garha Chronicle. It's a very small paper. And then I landed at a job with the Free Press Journal as a city reporter. So this was my first month. I was excited. I was doing all kinds of things. I was doing press conferences, interviewing celebrity. I was like really excited. My father was observing this. So on one of the off days, he took me to the Raymond store. And from there, he bought me a beige cloth material for a business suit. He gave it to me and said, now wear this business suit for all the press conferences. So I was like, that's so sweet. Thank you. But he also told me one more thing. He said, each time you wear this business suit, remember this. What do you represent? Who do you represent? What do you stand for? My father to this day has no idea that I've followed that principle all through my writing career. And that became my first principle. Know what you represent. Who do you represent? That's my first principle. Now, how do I apply this in my writing principles? How do I apply this in my storytelling principles? So roughly 70% of my clients are actually technology companies. Now these technology companies have a common problem. They cannot explain technology products and their technology software in simple words to other people or especially their customers. That's their common problem. Thank God, because that's why they need me. So one such company was Alpha. Let's call it Alpha because NDA. So Alpha was the company that was selling data management software. They were in the business for good 6 months and they were doing well. The only problem was each time they approached their customers, the process of telling or explaining their product was kind of difficult. So they came to me, they were like, what can you do? So I asked myself the same principle, I remember the same principle. I was like, who am I representing here? So I said, who are your customers? Who are your end buyers? So they said typically American males in the leadership position, CEOs, CTOs, directors within the age group of 45 and 55. So I was like, okay, so right now I'm representing this American male aged between 45 and 55. What does he like? What does he like? What does he do on weekend? What does he eat? So in one of those Google searches, I came across this blog that says 5 Lego games every American has played. So this Lego word intrigued me and I was like, this is a game we all have played. And the more I thought about Lego, I realized the resemblance and the similarities between these two. So this is what happens in a Lego game. Lego has building blocks. So you have these blocks and you can create anything out of it. So let's say you can create a hospital, you can create a truck, you can create a tractor out of these Lego blocks. Within an online system, this is what happens. You're sitting over a ton of customer data, and that data does not make sense because it's scattered around. Now, all you have to do is arrange those data blocks in the most logical way possible so that it starts to make sense. This is exactly what Alpha was doing for the customers. So I finally found my analogy and I was like, okay, I'm ready to go, and this is what I wrote. Managing data is like playing a game of Lego. There are many ways to create a whole. We help you find your perfect whole. So when I wrote this, immediately the marketing team understood it and they were like, okay, now we finally have an analogy. We can explain our data management software to people. All this happened because simply I asked myself that question, who was I representing in that specific moment? Whenever I think about representing, it helps me get into the shoes of my readers, which means it teaches me empathy. It also helps me understand the values of those readers. And most importantly, context. The time I started my career as a freelance writer, I was told content is the king. But the more I understood this career, I'm realizing context is the king. I don't think content will make sense without a context. This representation principle helps me understand the values and the context of the readers. And of course, it helps me come up with clever analogies. Now let's come back to the professor's story. You remember where I left it, right? And I'm sure by now you've guessed. I did not send that revenge courier. I did not do that. In that moment, I remembered, wherever I go, I talk about Jesus Christ. I say, I'm an ardent follower of Jesus Christ. And the biggest epitome of that is, Jesus Christ taught us forgiveness. So in that moment, I knelt down and I said, God, I forgive this man. A strange weight lifted off my chest. I felt free and I was like, okay, now even though I quit Times of India, nobody cares. This representation principle has saved me a ton of energy I would have wasted in unnecessary revenge. With this first principle, I want to challenge you today. Who do you represent? What do you stand for? The answers to these questions might change at least some of your life's perspectives. So that's the first one. The second one, while you were listening to that professor story, apart from listening, something else was happening. Scientists are calling it neural coupling or brain coupling. In 2010, a group of researchers did a study and they recorded the brain responses of a storyteller who was telling her story, her prompt story, and the listeners. During this course of storytelling exercise, they realized that the brain activity of the listeners started to mirror the brain activity of the storyteller. And as a result, listeners began to develop feelings of loyalty, of love, of bonding with that specific storyteller. This is why businesses around the world are telling us brand stories. Why? Because when we hear a good story, we trust that person, we trust that brand. If you really ask me, we're not buying products or services anymore. We're really buying stories. Now, as a writer, I learned the storytelling principle pretty early in life. The more I observed storytelling, I realized that brands are able to earn loyalty and trust of their customers based on their story, yes, for a very long time. But over time, it starts to fade. Why is that? Good brands know the answer to this question. So over time, I tweaked this principle of storytelling. And I tweaked the storytelling to this. Be a story feeler. Now, there's no such word like that. I invented it. But what does that really stand for? Being a story feeler actually means that you not only tell good stories, you first listen to other people's stories. You become a listener first. And some of the greatest storytellers in the world are better listeners. So this is really a two-way exercise where I'm not only bent on telling my brand story, but I'm also listening to customer stories. What are those stories? We don't realize it, but customer grievances are customer stories. Customer feedback is customer stories. Customer reviews are customer stories. If brands don't listen to these stories, they become irrelevant over time. So this is how I learned this principle. Now, how do I apply it in my writing? I start with listening more. Each time I get a client brief, I ask the client a lot of questions. Questions like, so what are your customer stories? What are they like? What's their background? And then I try to involve my readers into my writing. So, for instance, I will typically start my blog with a question or a hypothetical situation that resembles the real life of the customers. I sometimes include actual customer stories into my blogs and website content. I try to involve the readers as much as I could. And then I try to capture feelings. So each time I'm given a certain blog or a website content, I imagine a scenario where if readers were to use the product or service of my clients, how would they feel? I try to infuse those feelings into my blog writing. Don't get me wrong, I don't use advanced vocabulary for that. I actually use simple words and I create an environment to infuse those feelings. Then I quote popular references. What does that mean? Readers and customers are readers and customers later. They are human beings first. They have preferences. So if IPL is going on, I will bring in the reference of IPL or a World Cup football, a Netflix show that people are talking about. Typically in my blog, you will find references of Breaking Bad, of Batman, of Avengers. Why? Because my readers are human beings first. Now, I've been practicing this for quite a while and I felt validated in 2020 when Think with Google did a research on Gen Z buyers. So Gen Z buyers are the largest buying demographic in the world. They are telling retailers, inspire me first, sell me later. It means Gen Zs are only buying those products and services that they feel aligns with their life story, with their narrative. So for instance, a Gen Z feels close to sustainability cause, he will buy products and services that align with that kind of narrative. Businesses are hiring Gen Z influencers and they're placing their products and services into the lives of Gen Z influencers, fitting them into their narrative and trying to inspire the rest of the generation. This is why being a story feeler becomes important. It means you are both a good listener and a good storyteller. Be a story feeler. This is the brand headline that I gave for this company called Seed Carts. Seed Carts creates e-commerce websites for B2B companies, for retailers, right? Now, this particular headline tells the story of a frustrated shopper that went on an e-commerce website to buy his dream phone. He got stuck at the payment gateway, so he abandoned the cart. He went to another e-commerce website, bought the same phone at a slightly higher price. But the first e-commerce retailer lost the business. This is the common pain point of most retailers around the world, not just Americans. So this was the headline which actually tried to capture the feelings of that particular frustrated shopper. This is what I meant by story feeling. Everybody is intent on speaking. How many of us really want to listen? We need more listeners in this world. The more I follow this principle of story feeler, I realize I need to lend a listening ear to people. Listening skills are the first step towards deeper relationships. So this is why we need to be story feelers. Speaking of stories, one more story, one last time. I was a journalist only for 4 years. Unlike most people imagine. I got into freelance writing after 4 years and it was difficult in the beginning. I was just calling people for work and it was not working out. I had absolutely no strategy whatsoever. One day I was on my scooter and I was standing at the Palacia Square and there was this huge hoarding. And it was beautiful. It was a stunning hoarding. But there was a major grammar error in that particular hoarding. So I kept standing and I was like, we can't do this. This is ridiculous. And then I noted down the number. I took out my phone, noted down my number. I called them later on. A kind lady was on the phone. So I, as politely as possible, I tried to tell her that, listen, there was an error on your hoarding. And I remember telling her things like, you're an education institution. You cannot afford this error. You must have spent like lakhs of rupees on this hoarding. So this lady was somewhat impressed. She called me to her office the next day. On the table, she kept a bunch of brochures and she said, can you find out errors in these? And I was like, happily. And then I ended up finding out quite a lot of errors in those brochures. This is how I landed at my first writing gig. And then I followed that marketing principle throughout my life. So then I started scanning English papers. And I would specially go for full page ads because lakhs of rupees. I would repeat that process. My success rate at the time was 8 on 10. And then when LinkedIn came in, I started applying the same principle on LinkedIn. Even today, that's how I get most of my work. I learned that marketing skill pretty early. Unlike most writers would typically go to a freelancing website. And I was on a freelancing website for good 1 week. And in that 1 week, I realized one thing. Writers were getting gigs not based on quality or value, but they were getting gigs based on cheap pricing and volume of work. And I didn't want to be one of those writers. I wanted to be different. So this is how I thought of this specific principle. And this is the principle. Step out of the line. So when you're standing in a queue, you're like everybody else. You need to step out of that queue, create your own stall, and start selling. That's how you make business. That's how you create your value. Unless you step out of the line, you cannot be extraordinary. Then you are part of the ordinary. So let's see how to apply this. You create your value first. So at the start of the session, I told you a story. And then I introduced my topic. So what I did was I created my value first. And then I introduced my topic. This is what you need to do. What are you good at? What are your skills? Can you be of any service to some people? If yes, that's your skill. You need to create your value. Know the decision makers. Who are the people who will give you your gigs, your jobs? They may be your friends, neighbors, family, extended family. Do you know them enough? Do you know their stories? If you know them, you will know how to make a compelling pitch. Know your pitch. What do you bring to the table? This is how you step out of the line, and I urge you to do that. In conclusion, I do want to recognize the amazing capabilities of generative AI. These AI tools are creating 2,000-word articles within a matter of a few seconds, within a matter of seconds. They're even creating stories and poetry. How do I stand out? How do I stay relevant? By staying human. I strongly believe that the only way to beat artificial intelligence in its game is to be emotionally intelligent. I, for one, am counting on that. Thank you so much.